It was a typical Tuesday afternoon in Los Angeles. Overcast skies, the faint smell of rain in the air, and a bus packed with tired commuters. The streets were slick from a morning drizzle, and the rush-hour crowd was just beginning to die down. Inside the bus, people clung to the poles, their gazes focused on the window or lost in their phones. The hum of the engine and the soft chatter of passengers created a rhythm, as if the city itself was settling into a lull. In the back of the bus, a woman stood, gripping the pole with one hand, her eyes scanning the crowded seats. She glanced at the man sitting by the window, his head slightly tilted down, lost in his own world. He was wearing a weathered jacket, simple jeans, and a beanie that shadowed his face. But even beneath the unassuming exterior, there was something about him that seemed oddly familiar. Her eyes narrowed. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place, but it didn't matter. The bus was packed, and she had been standing for too long. She needed to sit. She made her way down the aisle, weaving between passengers, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When she reached the empty seat beside him, she paused for a moment. The man hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her presence at all. "Hey," she finally said, her voice a little too loud. "That seat's taken." There was no immediate response, just the faint sound of the bus rumbling beneath them. She frowned. Did he not hear her, or was he simply ignoring her? Either way, she wasn't going to back down. She crossed her arms and stood there, staring at him. "I said that seat's taken." A small, almost imperceptible shift in his posture told her he had heard. Still, the man said nothing. He didn't even look at her. The tension in the air was thick, and the other passengers began to notice. Whispers started to ripple through the bus, but no one intervened. The woman could feel their eyes on her, some of them judgmental, some just curious, but she didn't care. She wasn't about to let him make her feel small. "Did you hear me?" she repeated, louder this time. "I'm not sitting next to you." Finally, the man looked up, just for a moment. His eyes, calm and steady, met hers, but instead of a confrontation, there was only silence. His face remained unreadable, like he was somewhere else entirely. The woman's heart raced. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not in a situation like this. The nerve of him. She stood there, rooted to the spot, waiting for him to speak, to say something. But nothing came. It was the strangest thing. It was as if he wasn't even bothered by her at all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The woman's irritation bubbled up like a boiling pot. She couldn't understand it. Was he so arrogant that he thought he didn't need to respond? Or was he just too busy playing the mysterious, cool guy to even acknowledge her simple request? Either way, she wasn't about to let him off that easily. The bus lurched forward as it pulled away from the curb, and the woman's grip tightened on the pole. Her eyes never left the man. His calmness only fueled her anger, and her mind raced with thoughts of how to make him react. She had dealt with people like him before, people who thought they could just coast through life, never needing to lift a finger or show any respect. As the bus picked up speed, the woman took a step closer, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. She wasn't just going to let this go, not now, not with the entire bus watching. She needed to put him in his place. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the hum of the engine. "I'm talking to you." The man didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He was as still as a statue, his gaze fixed on the window, completely uninterested in her words. Her mouth went dry. What kind of person does this? She couldn't decide if it was disrespectful or just downright frustrating, but in her mind, one thing was certain. He was trying to make her feel insignificant, and that wasn't going to happen. "You think you're too good to even talk to me, huh?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Her words were tinged with a hint of mockery now, as if trying to bait him into a reaction. The woman watched as the bus swerved through traffic, her pulse quickening with each passing second. She was pushing him, testing him. She wanted to see just how far she could go before he finally responded. Still nothing. The man didn't even blink. He just stared ahead, looking completely detached, as though she wasn't even in the same room. She shook her head, her patience wearing thin. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're being rude." At that, a few heads turned. A murmur rippled through the bus as passengers exchanged glances, but no one stepped in. The silence was oppressive, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. One elderly man sitting near the front glanced back at her, his face wrinkled with concern. "You ought to let it go, miss. Maybe he's just having a bad day." The woman's gaze snapped to the old man. She didn't need anyone's advice. She didn't need anyone to tell her how to handle this situation. "I'm not letting it go," she snapped. "People like him need to learn some manners." The bus continued on its route, the windows fogging up slightly from the humid air outside. The woman's anger flared again, but now there was something else simmering beneath the surface. A deep frustration that went beyond just this man on the bus. It was something about the entire situation, about the way she had been dismissed, without so much as a word. She was used to being the center of attention, used to people taking her seriously, to people noticing her presence. But this was something else entirely, and it infuriated her. Hit subscribe and leave a comment. With where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The bus seemed to stretch on forever. Every stop, every movement, only made the woman more anxious, more determined to provoke a reaction from the man who by now had become the embodiment of everything she couldn't stand. Calm, indifferent, unaffected, she wasn't sure why it was bothering her so much. After all, it wasn't like she was asking for anything unreasonable. She just wanted to sit down. But there was something about the way he ignored her that felt like an insult, as though her words didn't even matter. Her anger shifted, subtly at first, into something more aggressive. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him just sit there untouched by her words. She had to force him to acknowledge her, to face her. The woman shifted her stance, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She leaned closer, her breath just short of brushing the man's shoulder. "You think you're better than me?" she asked again, this time with more edge. Her voice carried across the small space of the bus, and she noticed a few passengers glancing nervously in her direction. "Is that it? Just because you think you're some big shot?" There was still no response from the man. Not a flicker of movement, not a change in expression. It was maddening. Her thoughts spun faster now. The more she thought about it, the more she realized it wasn't just about the seat. It was about power. He was challenging her power, making her feel small in a way she wasn't accustomed to, and she hated it. The woman looked at the people around her, trying to gauge if anyone would back her up, but the eyes that met hers were mostly sympathetic, and there was even one woman who seemed to offer a sad smile, as if she knew exactly what was happening. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Her hands shook slightly with frustration. She took a deep breath and straightened her back. "I'm not leaving until you acknowledge me," she said, her tone challenging. Still nothing. This silence, this refusal to engage, was starting to feel like a personal attack. Why was he doing this? Why didn't he respond like everyone else? It was almost as though he was in on some secret she wasn't privy to, some unspoken rule that she couldn't understand. The woman clenched her fists. Was she invisible to him? Did he think he could just sit there completely ignoring her, as if she didn't exist? No, she wouldn't let it slide. She couldn't. "Are you just going to ignore me forever or what?" she snapped, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Is that how you deal with people, huh? Just shut them down? Make them feel like they don't matter?" Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man's gaze flicked toward her. His eyes locked onto hers for the briefest of moments, and for the first time the woman thought she saw something almost imperceptible, pass between them, a flash of recognition. A hint of amusement, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The man turned his attention back to the window, leaving the woman hanging in the silence. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some even looking away. The tension in the air had reached its peak, but instead of feeling victorious, the woman felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding in her ears. She had wanted a fight. She had wanted to provoke him into something, anything. But now that she had his attention, she wasn't sure what to do with it. In the back of her mind, She knew this wasn't about the seat anymore. It wasn't even about him. This was about something deeper, something personal. The bus jerked to a stop at the next corner, and the doors opened. Keanu stood up without a word, and the woman instinctively watched him. He moved past her with such ease, so calm, that she almost didn't register what was happening until he was halfway down the aisle. And then, in an instant, he was gone, off the bus and into the rain outside, disappearing into the gray streets of Los Angeles, leaving nothing but the echo of his quiet departure behind. The woman stood frozen, her mouth dry. The bus doors closed and the vehicle pulled away from the stop, but the silence that had filled the air when Keanu had left seemed to linger, suffocating her. A sudden realization hit her. He hadn't needed to say a word. He hadn't needed to do anything. It was almost as though he had won without even trying. The bus rolled on, but for the woman, time seemed to stretch, dragging out with every passing moment. She sat down in the empty seat, her mind racing. The tension in the air had not just evaporated. It had shifted, coiled tightly in the pit of her stomach. She could still feel the remnants of the strange encounter, the one-sided confrontation that had left her unnerved and unsettled. What had just happened? She had come onto this bus with one goal in mind: to demand respect, to take what was rightfully hers. But now she couldn't stop thinking about how everything had unfolded. She had expected him to react, to at least argue, to stand his ground, but instead he had just walked away without a single word. Keanu Reeves. She whispered to herself under her breath. She had known something was off about him. It was impossible not to recognize him, the iconic face, the quiet presence. But in that brief moment of contact, she hadn't seen him for who he was. She had only seen a man who didn't respect her, and then just like that he'd left. A strange mix of emotions washed over her: frustration, embarrassment, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. She had been so sure that she was in control, that she had the upper hand. But now all she felt was empty. The bus ride continued, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop replaying the encounter in her head, trying to understand what it all meant. Was he so used to being ignored that he didn't even care about her provocation? Or was he so far above petty arguments that he couldn't be bothered to stoop to her level? At the next stop, the woman stood up to leave. The bus had become unbearable, suffocating with the weight of her own thoughts. She pushed her way to the doors, ignoring the curious glances of the other passengers. As she stepped off the bus, the cool air hit her face, and she was momentarily disoriented by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a dull glow over the city. Just as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a notification that made her freeze. Keanu Reeves spotted in downtown LA. Bus ride sparks conversation on social media. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly clicked on the link, her fingers trembling slightly. The headline read, "Keanu Reeves calmly shuts down a confrontation on the bus." The article described in detail the encounter that had just happened, but from an entirely different perspective. It painted Keanu as the hero, an unbothered figure who didn't engage with the woman, opting instead for calm silence. The author praised him for his grace under pressure, describing how he managed to avoid escalating the situation. The woman's stomach churned as she scrolled down, reading comments and reactions from other people online. The majority of them were filled with admiration for Keanu, people calling him classy, and a true example of how to handle confrontation. The article even included a quote from a bystander on the bus who described Keanu as cool as a cucumber. While the woman was portrayed as someone who was looking for trouble, she felt her blood boiling. She had tried to create a scene, and now she was the one who looked like the fool. Worse yet, the article made it seem like Keanu had handled it with such effortless composure, as though he was some kind of saint. There was no mention of her side of the story, no mention of the fact that she had been ignored and dismissed without so much as a glance. It hit her like a punch in the gut. Her entire worldview was shifting. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being someone who could take control of any situation. But this made her feel powerless. A wave of realization flooded over her. This wasn't just about the seat, or even about Keanu anymore. This was about how she had misjudged the situation, how she had let her pride, her need to assert dominance, cloud her better judgment. She thought she had been standing up for herself, but in reality, she had just been making a fool of herself. But there was something else too, something deeper that she couldn't ignore. The way Keanu had acted, so calmly, so effortlessly detached, had shown her something she hadn't even realized she needed to see. He had chosen not to engage, not because he was scared or weak, but because he knew that some battles weren't worth fighting. And that realization, though it stung, made her feel something she hadn't expected: respect. She stood there, outside the bus stop, her phone still in hand, as the world around her buzzed with the ongoing drama she had inadvertently started. She didn't know what this meant yet, but she knew it was the beginning of something. Maybe it was the beginning of her change. The woman stood there on the sidewalk, her phone still in her hand, the weight of the situation settling in. She had thought that confrontation was the key to power. She had imagined that by forcing a reaction, she could regain control over a situation where she felt ignored. But now, looking back, she realized how far off the mark she had been. It was strange. Her pride, her need to assert herself, had clouded her judgment. She had wanted to make a point, but in the process she had failed to see the bigger picture. She had tried to take control of a situation that wasn't hers to control. And worse, she had tried to bully someone into reacting. Someone who didn't take the bait. Someone who had done the exact opposite of what she expected. Keanu Reeves hadn't responded the way she thought he would. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. Instead, he had remained calm, unshaken by her words and actions. In fact, he hadn't even acknowledged her in the way she wanted him to. He had chosen to walk away, leaving her to face her own self-made trap. But now, sitting with the reality of what had happened, she couldn't help but feel something she had never expected: humility. She had been so sure of herself, so confident, that she was in control, that she hadn't realized how fragile that sense of power really was. And now she understood what Keanu had understood all along. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Taking a deep breath, she began to walk down the street, her steps slow and deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling of being exposed, like the walls she had built around herself had come crashing down. She had always thought of herself as someone who could control every situation, but in that one moment on the bus, she had seen just how fragile that illusion was. And somehow, in the aftermath, she found herself feeling more vulnerable than she ever had before. As she continued walking, she passed by a small cafe on the corner, the warm light spilling out onto the street. She paused for a moment, looking inside. A couple of patrons sat by the windows, sipping their drinks and talking quietly. She felt an impulse, something simple, something human, to just step inside and get a coffee. Maybe she could sit for a while and gather her thoughts. Maybe she needed to be alone to process everything that had just happened. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling as she entered. The barista behind the counter greeted her with a friendly smile, but the woman barely noticed. Her mind was still whirling. After ordering a cappuccino, she found a seat by the window. The quiet hum of conversation around her faded into the background as she sipped her drink. She let the warmth of the coffee settle into her hands, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to simply be. For so long, she had been caught up in the need to appear strong, to prove herself to others. But now, she realized, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about winning every battle or being the loudest voice in the room. It was about knowing when to step back, when to let go of the fight, and when to allow yourself to simply breathe. As she sat there, she thought about the moment on the bus. She thought about how, in that brief exchange, Keanu had taught her something invaluable: the power of silence, the strength in restraint. He hadn't needed to defend himself, and by not engaging, he had taken the power right out of her hands. It was a lesson in humility, a lesson in letting go of control. She didn't know what it would mean for her moving forward, but she knew one thing: something had shifted. And that shift, that moment of realization, felt like the first step toward something new. The door to the cafe opened again and a few more people entered. But for the woman, it didn't matter. She wasn't worried about who was watching anymore. She wasn't worried about what anyone thought of her. For once, she felt at peace. The noise, the rush, the need to prove herself, it all seemed so distant now. She took another sip of her cappuccino and let herself enjoy the stillness. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't in a hurry to move on to the next thing. She was content to be right where she was, and that, she realized, was the most powerful thing of all. The woman spent the next few days thinking about the encounter with Keanu, replaying it in her mind again and again. She had moved past the anger, past the frustration. Now, all she could think about was how the event had quietly reshaped her perception of herself and her place in the world. She was beginning to understand something she hadn't fully grasped before. The real power didn't lie in confrontation or in asserting dominance. It lay in how you carried yourself, in how you chose to respond to the world around you. Keanu had chosen silence, not out of weakness but out of strength. And it wasn't just about ignoring her. It was about being in control of his own reactions, his own energy. It was about not letting someone else dictate his mood or his response. She realized now how much strength that took. She wondered if she too could cultivate that same kind of strength, one rooted in calm, in knowing when to engage and when to let things go. As the days went by, the story of her confrontation on the bus continued to ripple through social media, picking up steam with each passing hour. It was strange to see her name mentioned in headlines, especially when the tone of the articles painted her as the antagonist. The public seemed to be enamored with Keanu's graceful handling of the situation, while she was quickly branded as the rude woman who couldn't handle being ignored. It stung, but it also made her reflect deeper. She had expected people to rally behind her, to agree with her. After all, she had been standing up for herself, hadn't she? But now, she saw things in a new light. The world had witnessed her attempts to control the situation, and while she had been convinced that she was in the right, it became painfully clear that her need for validation was ultimately what had led her astray. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting, but she knew one thing. This, the humility she was starting to feel, was the most difficult lesson she had ever learned. That night, as she sat on her couch scrolling through the endless comments about the incident, one stood out to her. It was from a woman named Sarah, who wrote, "I used to think silence was weakness, but now I realize it's strength. Keanu Reeves reminded me of that. Sometimes you don't need to argue to win. You don't need to shout to be heard." The comment struck a chord in her more than she expected. It made her stop scrolling, made her think about what she had learned too. The next day, she decided to take action. She didn't know exactly what it would look like, but she knew she had to make things right. Not just for herself, but for her understanding of power and humility. She needed to reflect on what she had been through and how she could grow from it. She picked up her phone and began typing a message, a simple post that would show her true reflection on the experience. It wasn't about regaining public approval, nor was it about justifying her behavior. It was about acknowledging her own mistakes and growth. The post read, "I've been thinking a lot about the bus ride and my reaction. At first I was angry. I thought I had to make a statement to prove something, but what I've learned since then is that real power comes from within. It's not about forcing a reaction from others. It's about how we choose to respond to the world around us. Keanu's quiet strength taught me that. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm grateful for this lesson. Growth. Humility." She hesitated for a moment before hitting post. There was a vulnerability in sharing this with her followers, but it felt right. For once, she wasn't trying to manipulate the narrative. She was simply sharing the truth. The post got a surprising amount of support. People were moved by her honesty, her ability to admit her mistakes and reflect on her actions. Many responded, with words of encouragement, some even sharing their own experiences of growth. It was a small act of vulnerability, but it had a far-reaching impact, not just on her followers, but on herself. That night, she lay in bed thinking about everything she had learned. It was strange how one small interaction could unravel so much. She hadn't been prepared for it, but now she felt a new sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. Keanu had taught her something essential. something that no one else had been able to show her. Not through words, but through action. He had shown her the quiet power of restraint, the strength in silence, and for the first time she felt like she was finally on the path to becoming the person she truly wanted to be. It had been a week since the bus incident, and the woman felt like a different person. Something had shifted within her, though she couldn't quite explain exactly what it was. The whirlwind of social media attention had subsided, but the introspection it had triggered had stayed with her. Every day she reflected more on the lessons she had learned, about power, humility, and the quiet strength that came from letting go. She had started noticing small changes in her behavior. She wasn't as quick to jump into arguments. She listened, more both to the people around her and to her own inner voice. She wasn't so focused on proving herself anymore. Instead, she was learning to just be. Her work colleagues, who had always seen her as brash and assertive, began commenting on how different she seemed. "You're much calmer lately," one of them remarked with a hint of surprise. She just smiled in response, grateful for the quiet transformation happening inside her. She was starting to realize that real strength wasn't about forcing your way through every situation. It was about having the courage to sit with discomfort, to be silent when needed, and to respond from a place of self-awareness rather than ego. The woman had also started practicing mindfulness in the mornings. She would take 10 minutes each day to sit in silence, focusing on her breath and letting go of the rush that had always defined her life. At first it had been difficult. Her mind constantly raced with thoughts and to-do lists, but slowly she began to notice a shift. She was less reactive, less consumed by the urge to control everything around her. She felt more grounded, more at peace. And then one afternoon, as she walked home from work, something unexpected happened. She found herself walking down the same street where the bus incident had taken place. She hesitated for a moment, remembering the chaos of that day, the tension, the frustration. It felt like a lifetime ago. As she passed the bus stop where it had all unfolded, she noticed something. There, standing at the corner of the street, was a familiar face, Keanu Reeves. It wasn't as if she had been searching for him, far from it. But seeing him there in the same place was an odd coincidence. He was waiting for a taxi, his back to her, and for a split second the woman wondered if he even remembered the encounter. But she quickly pushed the thought aside. After all, why would he? Without thinking, she took a deep breath and walked toward him. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, or why she was even walking up to him, but something inside told her it was important. As she approached, Keanu turned around. He gave her a brief, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that was warm but not overly familiar. It was as though he recognized her, but didn't feel the need to say anything more. "Hey," she said, her voice a little shaky at first, but then, as she looked him in the eye, she found her composure. "I just wanted to say thank you." Keanu raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "For what?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "For the lesson," she replied, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her, "the one you taught me without saying a word. I was angry that day, but now I see it differently. You showed me that real power is in how we choose to respond, not in how loud we can be." Keanu nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of her words. He didn't say anything in return, but his gaze softened. The woman realized that he wasn't looking for a response. He wasn't interested in a grand gesture. He had already taught her what she needed to know through his actions. The moment lingered between them for a beat longer, before Keanu turned his attention back to the street, clearly ready to leave. But before he did, he looked at her one more time. "You'll be okay," he said simply. And then, as if nothing had happened at all, he turned and walked away, his footsteps quiet against the sidewalk. She watched him disappear into the distance, feeling something shift once more inside her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to chase him or to try to prove herself. She didn't need to make a statement or force a connection. The woman understood now that the real journey was within. She had already started to change, and that was enough. She stood there for a few moments, taking in the city around her. The world was bustling as it always had been, but she felt different, more grounded, more at peace. And just like that, the woman realized that this moment, this small fleeting encounter, was the final piece of the puzzle. She had learned to accept herself, flaws and all. She had learned that silence was not an enemy, but a tool for clarity and strength. She had learned that she didn't need to fight for her worth. She smiled to herself, feeling a quiet pride in how far she had come. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she was content with where she was. Weeks had passed since that brief but meaningful encounter with Keanu, and the woman found herself reflecting on just how much had changed. She had come a long way since the confrontation on the bus, not just in how she saw the world, but in how she saw herself. The quiet lessons she'd learned had slowly begun to shape her everyday life. She was now more intentional with her words. When she felt anger bubbling up, she took a step back instead of reacting. In meetings at work, she was no longer the loudest voice in the room, but found that she didn't need to be. She was listening more, truly listening, and responding with thoughtfulness instead of the quick retorts that had once been her instinct. But perhaps the most noticeable change was in her interactions with others. There was a calmness to her now, a peace that radiated from her, even in the most stressful situations. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that she cared in a different way. Her approach to life had shifted from one of reaction to one of reflection. She had learned slowly but surely that she didn't need to force things, didn't need to control everything. Instead, she allowed life to unfold around her, and in doing so, she found a sense of serenity she had never known. Before, at work, her colleagues had started to notice. One afternoon, her manager, Sarah, pulled her aside after a meeting. "I have to admit," Sarah said, her tone soft but sincere, "I've noticed a change in you. You seem calmer, more confident in a way that doesn't need to be loud. It's really refreshing." The woman was taken aback at first, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that she was uncomfortable with the compliment, it was just that she hadn't expected anyone to notice. But hearing it, she felt a sense of pride mixed with gratitude. "Thank you," she replied quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've been doing some thinking." Sarah smiled knowingly. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." The next few weeks were filled with small moments like this, subtle shifts in the way people interacted with her. She wasn't the same person she had been, and in some ways, neither were they. People seemed to respond to her in a way that was softer, more understanding. One morning, as she walked into the cafe where she had first reflected on the incident, the barista gave her an encouraging smile. "You seem different," she said as she handed over the cappuccino. "In a good way," the woman chuckled, accepting the coffee. "Yeah, I think I am. Thanks for noticing." It was as if the world around her had started to mirror the changes within her. She no longer felt the pressure to prove herself, and in that freedom she had found a sense of peace. But even with all this growth, she still carried the lesson from Keanu with her. Every day she practiced the art of restraint. She learned to sit with the discomfort when it came, to not force a response but to allow herself to feel before acting. It was not always easy. Old habits, old ways of thinking still crept in now and then, but she was learning to recognize them, to step back, and to choose a different path. Her journey was still unfolding, and she wasn't entirely sure where it would lead. But that was okay. She had stopped needing all the answers. She had stopped needing everything to make sense right away. She was content to let things unfold as they would, to continue learning and growing, bit by bit. One afternoon, as she was walking home from work, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it and saw a headline that caught her attention. "Keanu Reeves stands by his values, inspires millions to find strength in silence." Curious? She clicked the link. The article talked about how Keanu had inspired people through his calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to kindness. It mentioned the incident on the bus and how, despite the tension, he had handled the situation with grace. The article also highlighted the ripple effect it had caused, a ripple that had touched people in ways they hadn't expected. As she read, the woman felt something stir within her. She had been a part of that ripple, in a way, not because of anything extraordinary she had done, but because she had been open to the lesson, to the change that was waiting for her. The ripple wasn't just about Keanu's strength or her own growth. It was about the way people influenced each other, often without even realizing it. It was about the quiet moments, The ones that didn't make the headlines, but that shifted hearts nonetheless. She thought back to the way she had felt in the aftermath of the confrontation. At the time, she had felt like she was nothing more than a person trying to get attention, but now, in hindsight, she saw that the encounter had been a catalyst for something much bigger. It wasn't just about her personal transformation, it was about the impact that transformation could have on others. The woman smiled to herself, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. She had learned that even the smallest actions could create change, that the way we treat others, the way we carry ourselves in the face of adversity, can ripple out into the world in ways we may never fully understand. As she stood there on the street, she looked up at the sky, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude. She didn't need to be famous, didn't need to be the loudest voice. She had already started to make a difference, and that was enough. The woman woke up that morning with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. There was something grounding about the simplicity of her routine now. No longer did she feel the need to rush, to overextend herself, or to fight for a place in the world. The world, it seemed, was no longer something she had to prove herself to. She was part of it just as she was, and that realization brought an overwhelming sense of contentment. Over the past few months, her life had settled into a rhythm of balance. She had learned to lean into silence when things got too loud, to choose her battles wisely, and most importantly, to accept herself. She still had moments of doubt, who didn't? But instead of spiraling, she sat with those doubts, acknowledged them, and let them pass. Her transformation had been subtle, but the people around her could see it. At work, colleagues who had once found her abrasive now approached her for advice. Her friends had commented that she seemed more present, more in tune with herself. And it wasn't just the external shifts that mattered. It was the internal peace she had found, the quiet strength that had allowed her to let go of the need to control everything around her. As she sat down to enjoy her coffee one quiet Saturday morning, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her old friend, Claire, who had reached out a few times over the past few months. They had drifted apart a few years ago, but now Claire seemed eager to reconnect. "Hey, are you free for lunch today? I've been meaning to catch up. We need to talk," the message read. The woman smiled softly. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of everything changing within her, there were still connections waiting to be mended. She quickly texted back, "Sure, I'd love to. Let's meet at the usual spot." The usual spot was a small bistro they used to go to back when they were both struggling to navigate their careers and personal lives. It felt nostalgic, but in a good way, like revisiting a part of her life that had shaped who she was today. A few hours later, she sat across from Claire at the cafe, the sunlight filtering through the windows and casting soft shadows on the table. Claire looked the same, but there was something different about her too. Perhaps it was the warmth in her eyes or the way she smiled more freely. They exchanged pleasantries and caught up on life. How work was going. What had changed in their personal lives. It was nice, easy conversation, but there was an undercurrent of something more. The woman could feel it, but she wasn't sure what it was. Finally, Claire spoke up, her voice quiet but sincere. "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything, about how we used to be, how you used to be, and I guess I wanted to say that I see the change in you. I can tell you've grown, and it's inspiring." The woman blinked, surprised by the admission. "You've noticed?" Claire nodded. "Yeah. You've always been strong, but now it feels like you're more at peace with yourself. I don't know how to explain it. It's like you found this quiet strength that I've never seen before." The woman smiled gently, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I've learned a lot in the past few months, a lot about myself and about the way I've been living. It's been transformative." Claire's eyes softened and she leaned forward. "I think that's why I wanted to reach out. I've been going through my own stuff, and I've been struggling to figure things out. But seeing you, seeing how you've changed, it's made me realize that maybe there's a better way to handle things than just fighting through them. I don't have all the answers, but I think I need to learn to let go a little." The woman reached across the table and took Claire's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone in that. It's not easy, but sometimes the best thing we can do is just sit with where we are without rushing to change everything. We can't control everything around us, but we can control how we respond to it. Claire nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Yeah, I think you're right. I've been holding on so tight, thinking that if I just push harder, everything will work out. But maybe the answer is to stop pushing so hard and let things come as they will. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. It wasn't a resolution to everything, but it was a step. The woman realized that sometimes the most important conversations were the ones where no answers were given, just the acknowledgement that both people were on their own journeys of growth, and that was enough. The rest of their lunch passed in easy conversation, the kind that left them both feeling lighter, as if they had shared something important, even if it was unspoken. When they parted ways, there was no grand farewell, no promises of constant contact. It was just a quiet understanding that, like her, Claire was on her own path to peace, and that in time they would continue to support each other along the highway. As the woman walked back home, she reflected on the full circle she had come through. Her journey had begun with a confrontation, a small moment of tension on a bus that had unknowingly set her on a path of introspection and change. And now she had come to understand that the real power didn't lie in what she could force or control, but in how she chose to live from a place of peace, grace, and humility. It had been a hard journey, but it had been worth it. And as she stepped into her apartment, she realized that the journey wasn't over. It never would be. Life would continue to challenge her, to offer lessons in the most unexpected ways, but now she knew she was ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?